Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming on such a beautiful evening to hear this excellent lecture. I'm trying to keep the mic in my mouth. Unfortunately, Robert Gordon, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, came down with a really bad cold. His last message was, almost dead. So, apologies, I have to take his place, and it's too bad because Rob is a really good MC. Events like these cannot happen on their own, and certainly there's a lot of thank yous to be done. I would like to thank the staff of Hellenic Studies, and that is Maria, Lauren, Chris Dickert. They do an excellent job. I hope they're not listening because they'll want to raise after. And of course, the Faculty of Arts, the Dean's Office, have always been very supportive. And they come to our events. If not in person, they send representatives. And it is my pleasure tonight to talk about Edward and Emily McWhinney, who were two people who were Philhellenes, people who were very sympathetic towards things Greek. And when Ted passed away, he left in his will enough money for another position in Greek studies, but also for the McWhinney Lecture, which we have every year. And in memory of him and his charming wife, and I wish he were here, he would have really enjoyed this lecture. I mean, of all the people. He would have gotten up and given another lecture after, but he would have really enjoyed it. I'm very happy tonight to introduce a colleague and someone who's an expert on Europe, Dr. Loukas Tsoukalis, and I have to read because he's got so many affiliations and awards. He has taught at several universities in Europe and North America, including the universities of Oxford, the London School of Economics, Sciences Po in Paris, the University of Athens, the College of Europe, the European University Institute in Florence, Harvard University at the Kennedy School. He is the author of many books, some of which I have actually read and understood, and articles on European integration and international political economy. He has advised the former president of the European Commission and the former president of the European Council. He is the president of Greece's largest think tank, LEMEP, and he now teaches in Paris and Bruges. His latest book, In Defense of Europe, Can the European Project Be Saved?, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has received the Legion of Honor of the French Republic for his contribution to European integration, as well as many other academic awards and honors. Enjoy the lecture, and the audience is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm indeed honored to be invited to deliver this second annual lecture in memory of Edward and Emily McWhinney. I should like to thank my hosts, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies, Professor Loukas in particular, for the kind invitation and for his kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here and thankful for the opportunity to visit this beautiful city. I hadn't been here before, to visit the Hellenic Center at the university, and also, last but not least, to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on a subject which is very important for Europe, the UK in particular, and I shall argue a subject that will have broader implications for the liberal global order. So what I propose to do tonight is try to explain, first of all, why the British decided to leave the European Union and what is likely to happen to both the UK and the rest of the European Union, and then draw some more general conclusions about the future of European integration and what it means for the rest of the world. So it's a tall order. I shall try to do my best. So, this is the title, Brexit and the European Union, Is There Life After the Divorce? Let me start with some brief historical comments. Europe has been engaged since a few years after the end of the Second World War in a radical political experiment. I would call it a revolutionary political experiment, which is about peace and reconciliation and open borders on a continent which has, as you know, a long and glorious history, but also a history that is marked by bloody conflict and many wars. And the project is about open borders, but also about the joint management of ever-increasing interdependence, hence the sharing of sovereignty between countries that invented sovereignty in the first place. So in that respect, it is revolutionary. And this is what we call European integration, and for the initiated, it is the European project. Now, this European project has been characterized for the last 60 years or so by continuous expansion in terms of both membership and functions. We started with 6 countries, we ended up with 28, -1 next year, and there are many more to join, waiting in the waiting room for the green light to enter the main living room. And we started with 2 sectors of the economy, namely coal and steel, and we ended up with just about everything. And for many people, Europe was perceived as a kind of model, a model that attempts to reconcile sovereignty with interdependence, a European social model as well, an attempt to reconcile democracy and markets. And the European Union often pretended that it offered a different mode of behavior in international relations, relying essentially on soft power, and this is something that would be familiar to you Canadians. Now, European integration went well for many years. Of course, it had its ups and downs, many peaks and troughs, but in recent years, European integration has been marked by very serious crises. And there were successive crises that gradually morphed into a kind of an existential crisis for European integration. I shall concentrate very briefly on the 2 main crises, which is interesting that both crises of recent years were originated from outside the European borders, but when they entered the European Union, they exposed the weakness and vulnerability of the European construction. So, first you have the bursting of the biggest international financial bubble since 1929. That happened in 2007-8. It started in the United States, and then it became an existential crisis of the euro, which is not obvious. Why should an international financial crisis starting in the United States become an existential crisis for Europeans and for their common currency? And then the second crisis was the refugee crisis, where again, the origin was the implosion of a large part of Europe's neighborhood. And that implosion of Europe's neighborhood led to the export of increasing numbers of immigrants, refugees, and occasionally terrorists that therefore exported instability to the European continent. Now, because of those crises and many other problems, there were many people in Europe, but even more so in the rest of the world, and especially in the United States, but also in the UK, who at some point started saying, this is the end of the road. I mean, the Europeans cannot survive all that. Certainly the euro will not be able to survive the kind of crisis that is going through. So they were predicting more and more the end of European integration. The good news is that it hasn't happened as yet. The bad news is that we've paid a rather big price in order to survive. What we did discover in the process is that the Europeans may not be very quick in managing crises, collective crises, but they have a very strong instinct of survival when they reach the edge of the precipice. And why do they have a strong instinct of survival? Because essentially, when love is lost, so they stop loving each other, what keeps them together is fear. And there are 2 different kinds of fear that are very important in Europe that have kept the European show on the road and are likely to continue keeping the European show on the road for years to come. One is the realization that no individual European country, including those that used to be called big European countries, can no longer count for very much in a world in rapid change in a world where size matters a great deal. Even Germany or France cannot do very much on their own in such a world, although many British think otherwise about themselves. So, and the second fear is the fear of the cost of divorce, namely the realization that disintegration would imply a huge political and economic cost for individual member countries. So it is fear that kept the Europeans together, and the illusion, as far as many British are concerned, that they can do otherwise. So let me now explain why the British are apart. I argue that Brexit, to some extent, was an accident waiting to happen. So let me explain why I think it was, to some extent, an accident waiting to happen. First of all, British political elites never felt as co-owners of the European project. The British, at best, considered Europe participation in European integration as some kind of a transactional affair. It was based on the argument, if you can't beat them, join them. Remember that the British decided not to join in the first place. And in fact, if Britain had decided to join the European integration project from the very beginning, the British would have been able to shape the process of integration in a pretty strong fashion, because for years Britain was the most important and most powerful European country after the end of the Second World War. The British decided not to do so, and to put it cynically, for those of us Europeans who think that the European project is important, I should add undiplomatically that luckily they didn't, because if they had done so, European integration would have ended up as a much more loose organization than the one we have today. So, but there are also turning points in the relationship, and one important turning point is the decision of other Europeans in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to create a common currency. Now, the creation of a common currency is the most important act of integration ever, for obvious economic and political reasons. The British felt that that was a step in integration too big and too far, and they felt very uncomfortable because they realized they couldn't stop it, but they also couldn't join. So they decided to have an opt-out from monetary union. I'm not suggesting it was a wrong decision by the British. In fact, I think with the benefit of hindsight, the Europeans were not prepared politically and institutionally to have a common currency. But having said that, once you do have a common currency, it would be even bigger mistake to undo it. All right? Sometimes undoing a mistake is an even bigger mistake than the one in the first place. So the British decided to stay out of monetary union, and in fact, this was the precursor of other things to come, because from the early 1990s onwards, the British kept on accumulating exceptions and opt-outs inside the European Union. And this led to growing marginalization, isolation inside the European Union, hence also frustration. So it was a cumulative process from the early 1990s onwards. And the third important thing that happened is that with the arrival of the new countries, the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the British government, unlike all the other European governments, decided not to apply the long transitional period for the free movement of people, because the then Blair government thought that migration was good for the economy, and if it was good for the economy, it would be good for the country. But number two, because the prediction of the Home Office was that very few people would actually migrate. What happened instead is more than 1.5 million people moved from Central and Eastern Europe to the UK. The UK was the biggest recipient of people from other European countries until 2015, when Germany became the biggest a recipient, and migration became the most important issue leading to Brexit. So the first point I tried to make was that Brexit was not something that happened out of the blue. There was a succession of events that were gradually leading to that possibility. But again, nothing is inevitable in history, so I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think that Brexit also has to do with developments outside the European Union, with the change of the economic environment, and with the way the UK managed or mismanaged its relationship with the globalizing world. Let me explain what do I mean by that. Britain, together with the United States of that period, not today, was the leading flag bearers of financial liberalization and economic globalization. And the belief was, especially of the Blair government that lasted for 12 years, as far as I remember, was that liberalization would be like a tide that lifts all boats. That prediction was not proven to be exactly correct. Globalization brought benefits to the country as to other countries participating in the process, but it also led to increasing inequalities within the UK. That should remind you a bit of what is happening in the countries south of your border. The other problem is that the Conservative and the Labour Party, the two main parties on the British political scene, converged in terms of economic ideology. There was very little difference in terms of their main approach to economic policy. And the problem is that in a country that was experiencing growing inequalities and an increasing number of people who felt left behind, who felt they were losers from economic change, the critical question was who represents the losers? And the UK in the process became more unequal and more disunited. And the disunion was not only in terms of incomes, but it was also in terms of the nations that form part of the United Kingdom. So the attitude in England has turned out to be very different from the attitude prevailing in Scotland. So my argument is it was not only an accident waiting to happen, but Brexit is to some extent also the victim of collateral damage. And collateral damage is related to the process of globalization, essentially on a neoliberal economic agenda. Now, Brexit referendum. Of course, all those things did not necessarily lead to Brexit. There's no automatic connection between those things and the decision to leave. Other countries had experienced not exactly the same, but fairly similar developments. And then comes the decision of the then Prime Minister Cameron to offer a referendum in order to deal with an internal problem within his own party. His own party was torn apart on the issue of EU membership, and Cameron thought that this was the way to placate the Brexiteers, and with the belief that it would be easy for him to win the referendum if he was finally forced to hold it. So he then decided that before having a referendum, he should have a renegotiation exercise. So go and tell the rest of the Europeans that I'm going to have a referendum, but before having a referendum, I want to change the terms of Britain's membership of the European Union. He was not terribly original in that respect, because Harold Wilson had done exactly the same back in 1975, but then it was a decision of a Labour minister to deal with the internal problem of the Labour Party and not the Conservative Party. So Cameron was to some extent repeating the Harold Wilson experiment. The trouble is that that renegotiation was really not much about much, because the rest of the Europeans were not prepared to engage in a serious negotiation about British terms of entry, because they first of all thought that Britain had accumulated so many exceptions that there was no point in adding more exceptions to the list, and also, very importantly, for two other reasons, which I think are important. One is that Mr. Cameron had succeeded in literally alienating virtually every colleague he had in the European Council. And number two, because most of the other European leaders mistakenly believed that the British would finally not decide to leave. So we moved to the referendum campaign. The referendum campaign had three main issues that dominated the debate. One was immigration, by far the most important. There was a very large number of British people who felt that immigration had gone too far and immigration was the fault of EU membership. The second issue was related to immigration, but more general, namely, take back control. We are losing sovereignty. So we are losing sovereignty to those foreign Europeans through the European Court of Justice, through common rules, through inability to control our borders and so on, while the people who were in favor of Remain were basically were engaging in a scare campaign, trying to tell the population that if we leave, it's going to be an economic disaster. And hardly anybody was saying that the EU was a good thing. The best argument that usually the remaining people could afford to offer was, it's not as bad as it looks. All right? And this is not the kind of argument that can win you a referendum. And what happened with the Brexit referendum in June 2016 was that it revealed very deep divisions in British society. The campaign was toxic, and it was characterized by fake news. So it was an hors d'oeuvre of what the world was going to experience a few months later with the US presidential election, in many ways. Now, if you think about it, what was the real choice facing British people? The real choice facing British people was not exactly the question that they were asked to answer in the referendum. In the referendum, British people were asked to choose between remaining in the European Union or leaving the European Union. The choice was, in fact, not exactly that. It was more complicated, but complicated questions cannot easily be asked in a referendum. What was the choice for the British people? The choice was between those two things. On the one hand, continue with a semi-detached membership with voting rights, because this is precisely what the UK had at the time. The UK had a list of very important exceptions, including exception from the common currency, exception from the passport-free zone of the so-called Schengen area. These are two of the most important things of European integration. The British were out. So the British had a choice between staying in this semi-detached membership but keeping their voting rights, and the alternative, looking for a new kind of relationship to be negotiated but without voting rights. And 52% of the population, in their collective wisdom, opted for the latter. Now, it's interesting to see what were the main lines of division that marked the decision of the referendum. The country was deeply divided. And these were the four main factors that determined whether somebody would vote for Remain or leave. First, the more educated you are, the more pro-European you are. The differences are very big indeed. That, again, has considerable similarities with what happened south of your border. All right? So if you are somebody with school education, you would have a significant majority for leaving. The more degrees you had, the more pro-European you were. Age, very important factor. Something like 70% and more of those over 65 voted for leave, and about 70% of the young ones voted for remain. What does this mean? It means that British parents and grandparents have decided to deprive their children of their European future, if you want me to put it bluntly. This is precisely what happened, because the differences in percentage terms are enormous in terms of age. Number three, again not surprising, income and wealth. The richer you are, the more pro-European you are. The fourth factor is interesting, and this is probably surprising. People of ethnic origin, Caribbean, Pakistani, and so on, produced very large majorities in favor of remain, not leave, which is not obvious. That somebody of a Caribbean or Indian origin feels more comfortable with a European legal order than with a purely British legal order. And this is, I find it very interesting indeed and rather surprising, or perhaps surprising. And if I were again to be undiplomatic, which I've been all along, this is the phrase I would use. Brexit was won by an unholy alliance of old-age English nationalists and the sans-culottes, the losers from economic globalization, which is a very strange alliance, if you think about it. So you have, on the one hand, people of a certain age who feel uncomfortable with the modern world, who feel uncomfortable with sharing sovereignty with other Europeans, but who may be fairly rich, and who, a friend of mine actually referred to them, he used even more diplomatic terms, he says, old-age members of English golf clubs. That's one group, and the other group are the losers in the old industrial heartlands in the Midlands and elsewhere in the UK, which is a very interesting alliance, because it's a kind of alliance that can win an election, but cannot hold together afterwards, because they don't have common interests. And this is the problem that Brexiteers have to manage today. Okay, so the day after, I call it a crash landing. For those of us who consider Britain to be the country with the most sophisticated democratic institutions, with a long history of democracy, which is in fact true, it came as a shock to realize, at least those of us who didn't know enough what was going on, that most Brexiteers had absolutely no plan about the day after. And those who had a plan often lived in a kind of cuckoo land as to British negotiating power and what kind of alliances Britain would have after the Brexit. Let me explain what I mean by all that. It's been very painful. I mean, between June 2016 and today, it's been an extremely painful experience for most of my British friends. Now, what is at issue? What is at stake? The British, whether they leave the European Union or not, they are leaving, they know that their economy is closely integrated in the European economy. The EU is by far the biggest trading partner of the rest of the UK. 50% of trade in goods and services is done with the rest of Europe. No trade partner can replace the hole created by Brexit. I mean, even if Britain were able to sign free trade agreements with everybody, including Canada, the United States, and China, it does not compensate if the British lose the European market. So that's number one. So, in a sense, the trade-off that the British are presented with is, on the one hand, they want to preserve access to that market, because their economic agents need it for survival. And on the other hand, they want to maximize their sovereignty and their ability to control the borders as far as immigration is concerned. So you are trying to reconcile those two things, which is not easy. Because, and I will explain in a minute why also it is particularly difficult. The other thing they have to reconcile is the interests of the members of golf clubs and the interests of the losers from globalization. Because some members of the British Conservative Party are arguing for global Britain, for free trade agreements left, right, and center with everything, while a large number of people who voted for Brexit are looking for protection and for protective barriers, not for free trade. Okay? So now you are trying to reconcile two very different groups that voted for Brexit, which is not easy at all, which is in fact impossible. Then people realize there's another very serious problem that most people hadn't even thought about. And this is peace in Northern Ireland for years has been largely linked to the elimination, the complete elimination of a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And this was possible because both Northern Ireland, as part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland are members of the European single market. If Britain is no longer a member of the single market or the customs union, there has to be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. First of all, the Republic of Ireland is threatening with a veto, but forget even the threat of a veto of the Republic of Ireland. The problem is this coexistence between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland has been largely dependent on the existence or the non-existence of a border. So if you do introduce again a border, you change the rules of the game, and that's going to be very difficult. And then the last thing that many Brexiteers discovered is that there is a very big asymmetry of power between the two sides in the negotiation. Namely, if for Britain the EU represents 50% of its trade, for the EU it represents about 15 or 12% of its trade. The EU is a big economic bloc. And the EU certainly does not want, if you want to put it again cynically, to make Brexit a big success, because it could be a precedent for others to follow. And in the negotiations that have been happening between June 2016 and today, the British negotiating team has experienced a very unpleasant crash landing, because they were forced to accept or to swallow things that were considered to be totally unswallowable only a few months earlier. So what happened is that British politics sank low and the Europeans played tough. I spent many years of my life in the UK, and this is a country I really love. It's my second country. And I tell, and this is, I don't mean it in a joking way, I tell some of my British friends that if a country like the UK, with the sophistication of its institutions and its history, its politics can sink so low, there is very little hope for the rest of us normal countries in Europe. But we have to wait and see. I suppose I hadn't seen in 2015 what was going to happen in the United States. Now, what's the timetable? The timetable is that the UK leaves the European Union on 29 March, I think it's even 11 o'clock, of 2019. So 1 year from now. This is unavoidable. There is no way of reversing this. Nobody is talking about another referendum between now and then. It is a foregone conclusion that Britain will leave the European Union 1 year from now. Now we also know, almost certainly, although there is with a proviso of dealing with the Irish problem, that Britain will have a transitional period after it leaves that will end on 31 December 2020. What does this mean? Is that until the end of 2020, Britain will be a de facto member in economic terms of the European Union. It will have complete access to the single market. It will be paying, as it's paying before, to the budget. It will apply all EU rules. European Court of Justice decisions will apply to the UK as well. There will be no control of immigration. And what's the difference? The UK will have no voting rights in European decision making. So between the referendum day and the end of 2020, the British will enjoy the great privilege of having all the economic things of membership of the EU, but without voting rights. They will be applying all the rules, they will be paying everything in order to have access to the market. So I suppose this cannot be considered as a great political victory. And then, what are the choices facing the British, which are very difficult choices? Now, they are trying to gain some time in order to decide what kind of relationship they want to have with the EU. Taking into consideration, as I said before, that British companies are part of international, and to a large extent, European supply chains, that the British economy is integrated in the European economy, and if you decide to disintegrate it, the cost will be very high in economic terms. So the British have to choose a kind of relationship with the EU, judging trade-offs. What are the alternatives? I think, simplify a bit, there are three main alternatives. They thought they had four, but I think the fourth one does not exist. One is the Norway model. The Norway model means that you apply all the rules of the European Union, including all the decisions of the European Court of Justice. You have no control of your borders, but you have access to the European market. So the Norwegians are de facto members of the European single market without voting rights. So this is an unlikely option for the British because it is really so much worse than what they had before. You can't do that. And I think it is important, one thing where no British government can retreat is that there has to be some control of immigration. No British government can accept anything that does not enable it to have some control over borders, given that immigration became the hottest issue, rightly or wrongly, but that's a fact of life. So the Norway option is not really an option. There is a Turkey option. Turkey has a customs union agreement with the European Union. So it's a customs union, it's a free trade in goods, and it has also a common external tariff vis-à-vis the rest of the world. A customs union would enable the British not to have a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is very important. But a customs union means that Britain would not be able to sign independently trade agreements with other countries. And that politically is not easy. Many people in Britain, especially those who are the frustrated ones on the Remain side, are fighting for the customs union agreement, right? Because they're saying this is the best way to minimize the economic cost of Brexit. Politically, I think it is unlikely that any British government can accept that. So what they are left with is try to follow the Canadian example, or some version of the Canadian example, with the kind of free trade agreement that Canada signed with the European Union after God knows how many years of negotiations. In the beginning, British governments were speaking about bespoke arrangements. Now there is, I think, a limit to how much bespoke an arrangement can be. So the British want access for their goods and especially their services, because Britain is essentially an exporter of services. And it's not only the City of London, but it is entertainment industry, legal services, and so on and so forth. So the key question is how those services will be affected if Britain is no longer part of the European single market. And in order to be part of that market, Britain may have unilaterally to adopt EU rules and regulations that are adopted in Brussels without Britain's participation. So the choice is pretty awkward, very difficult. And I think Britain will look for a special relationship, and there it has a comparative advantage in terms of security. I mean, in Europe today and for years, there are basically 2 carnivore countries, while the rest are vegans. So it's only the UK and France that have armies that can actually play a role and wage a war. All the others are vegetarians at best, including Germany. So the British are looking for a way of reconciling 2 things, or rather deciding what is the economic price they are prepared to pay for more relative independence. This is really what it boils down to. I'm not suggesting this is a fictitious choice. It is a real choice. So when British people decided to cut their ties with the European Union, were they also ready to cut their ties with economic independence? So the question facing British governments, whichever government is going to be in power, is really what is the economic price you are prepared to pay to be more independent? And we don't know what the answer will be, but the choice will be difficult and limited. Okay. So I think I have another 10 minutes or so. Somebody has my clock. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let me now move on to discuss the prospects for the European Union without the UK. Let me go through some of the main challenges facing the EU of 27 and probably more in the years to come, because there will be probably more enlargements. I'm not suggesting that this is an exhaustive list, and I certainly do not pretend that those challenges that I will go through very quickly will be easy to deal with. Some of them will be familiar to other countries of the developed world. Some are very peculiar to this strange animal, which is a sui generis confederation of countries, which is the EU. All right. Now, first main challenge is how to make the most important act of integration, namely a common currency, a more sustainable one. And the euro crisis in recent years has been a very big one. The price paid by Europeans, some more than others, has been very heavy in order to preserve the euro. The governance of the euro is much stronger now than it used to be. We have done things that were unthinkable 15 years ago. We have the almost two-thirds of a banking union, which means that all big banks in Europe are supervised by a common agency and not by national authorities. The decision as to whether a bank folds up or is given help, has a bail-in or a bail-out, is again a European decision, no longer a national one. So if somebody told you that this would happen in so-called sovereign countries, your answer would have been 10 years ago, no way, McKay. Well, it did happen. But still, the euro is, I think, on rather weak legs. So there will have to be even more difficult decisions. And clearly, more integration for the euro will mean more differentiated integration in the EU, which means there are the countries that have the euro and the countries that do not have the euro. And that is the biggest line of separation inside the European Union. So there is the very integrated group of countries and the others. So it's a differentiated form of integration. The second major challenge is the EU, because of a changing economic environment, has to change the division of economic powers between national authorities and European authorities. To give you an example, taxation, until recently, used to be the preserve of national authorities. The only thing we had in common was that we have the same kind of indirect taxation, a VAT. But as far as direct taxation, company taxation, and all the rest, this is a national prerogative. Now, increasingly, there is pressure for the European Union to play a role. Why? Give you an example. We discover that large multinational companies, especially digital companies, are avoiding or evading taxation on a massive scale. Now, the only way to deal with that is not at the national level because it's not effective. The only way to deal with that is at the European level. And the European Commission is now proposing a new European tax for digital companies based on sales and not revenue, because if it is on revenue, the companies can shift profits extremely easily from one country to the next. Okay. So these are already signs of a changing division of labor. But there are other ones. There is more coordination of fiscal policies, and there is more discussion of a common unemployment insurance scheme, a bit of redistribution in a world where the number of losers, not so much between countries, but within countries, is increasing rapidly. Another kind of challenge, foreign policy and security. First of all, foreign policy has been at best mildly coordinated at the European level. Remember that for years, the Europeans operated under a series of assumptions. One was that Europe was under the US nuclear and military umbrella in general, number one. That the neighborhood was manageable. And number three, there was a division of power. Some of the dirty job was done by national governments, while EU institutions exercised soft power. Now, all those assumptions have collapsed, or are in the process of collapsing. US military protection in a Trump era is no longer taken for granted in most European countries. Mr. Putin has become increasingly revisionist as far as the rules that the West has adopted for global order is concerned, and most of our neighborhood is catching fire. I mean, if you look around, if you look at the map of Europe and its neighborhood, it is an arc of instability, starting from the Ukraine, going down to Moldova, Georgia, and Caucasus, the Middle East, and North Africa. Not an easy neighborhood, and this is a polite way of putting it. And if we are serious, the EU should look for a real special relationship with the UK, because it's important, because it's an important country in Europe, and whatever decisions are taken in referenda, islands don't move away from the continent. And then the other big challenge for Europeans is how to exercise multinational democracy, which is what we're talking about as far as the EU is concerned, at a time when identity politics is coming back again with a vengeance, at a time when populism is getting stronger, and at a time when anti-systemic parties are doing increasingly well in an important number of European countries. Not easy. Am I suggesting that all those challenges will be met? Of course not. Some people say that, it's a very tall order. Europe cannot do it. Europe is like a big tanker. It takes a long time and much effort to change direction. It's a kind, once you change direction, so it's not flexible. It's not easy to change. But the good news is that when it comes to the crunch, most Europeans do realize what the stakes are. And let me come close to the end. If we fail, if we Europeans fail, this is going to be the effect. It will be a Europe weak, divided, and increasingly irrelevant in a world in transition, and there are much worse scenarios than that. A world in transition can be a world in flames. And if the European experiment comes to an end, this will have important implications for global liberal order, for two reasons. First of all, because today the EU is by far the biggest and most important defender of the global liberal order, once the United States has changed course. And number two, because if Europeans fail in jointly managing interdependence, that has implications for the management of global interdependence for the rest of the world. So I think the success or failure of the European experiment means quite a lot for the rest of the world. So let me then conclude. Does the European Union have a future? And my answer is that. Sure it does, but it will be pretty bumpy and with possible accidents on the way. Thank you very much.
Okay, we can take questions, a few questions, and there'll be people with a microphone coming to you. So just be patient and raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. Yes, sir. Hold on. The microphone's coming.
How do you see Europe and the UK after Brexit vis-à-vis the Soviet Union?
You mean Russia?
Russia.
Or maybe the Soviet Union.
Relations with Russia, of course, are both very important and also very difficult for Europe. They are very important because Europe shares a neighborhood with Russia. We have a number of countries in between, so you don't necessarily always choose your neighbors, but the neighbors are there. And Europe also has a very close economic relationship with Russia as far as energy is concerned. Many of our energy imports come from Russia, both gas and oil. Relations with Russia are perceived differently depending on which side of which fence you sit. If you are an Estonian, and therefore a former member of the Soviet Union, or if you are a Pole, you consider Russia, by definition, as a threat and an enemy, because that's what history teaches you, right? If you are a French, Italian, so those who are with a safe distance from Russia, can take a different approach and say that Russia could be a strategic partner and we have to find the ways to define the strategic partnership. Russia is one of the most difficult countries for EU to agree in terms of policy towards, for those obvious reasons. I certainly do not pretend that Mr. Putin is an easy guy to negotiate with, and this would be the understatement of the year. But I would hasten to add, and this may shock you, that the West, Europe in particular, but the United States even more, carry considerable responsibility for the fact that we mishandled relations with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. But that's my personal view. I know it is controversial. I believe that we had an opportunity to create a different kind of relationship with Russia, but we thought that the time of Mr. Yeltsin and all the oligarchs pillaging the country would be the normal way to proceed with Russia, and we paid the price.
Okay, next. Yes, sir.
I have basically a two-part question. In terms of the challenges facing the EU with Brexit, how would that affect the situation with Greece? And do you think Greece should withdraw from the euro currency or what?
So these are the two parts.
Yeah.
I mean, Greece, as you know, suffered enormously during the recent crisis. Greece was essentially a bankrupt country in 2010. The fact that it was bankrupt, it was essentially the responsibility and the fault of Greek governments that mismanaged the economy for years. Greeks lived beyond their means for years on borrowed money. Now you might argue that there is the biggest responsibility is for the one who borrows to sustain an unsustainable level of prosperity, but there's also a responsibility for those who lend the irresponsible borrower. But having said that, I think we all knew, unless we believed in extraterrestrial economics, in 2010, that Greece would go through a very painful adjustment. I mean, Greece had a budget deficit of 15% of GDP and a current account deficit of 15% of GDP in 2009. These are not sustainable things. The adjustment in the end proved to be much more painful and much longer than anticipated for two very simple reasons, if I have to simplify. One is that Greek governments did not take enough ownership of the reforms and the changes that were required. And Greece's lenders, led by Germany, imposed on the country a series of totally unrealistic adjustment programs. So I'm afraid the fault is not just on one side. Now Greece is coming out of the crisis slowly, but you asked whether Greece should leave the euro. I think it's interesting. I mean, Greece is one of the best examples of what I talked about before, namely fear, the fear of the cost of divorce. Because if you look at opinion polls, they show that Greeks are now no longer in love with Europe. In fact, we have one of the lowest levels, if not the lowest level of support for European integration. But then you ask the next question, do you want to stay or leave? And the answer is no, we want to stay. We may dislike it, but the alternative is much worse. And that is still the case, and I hope it remains, but I hope also that the policies change.
Okay, any other questions?
Given the density of population of, in particular, England versus countries like Germany, France, even Italy and Spain, why weren't the Europeans more sensitive to that huge influx that came into Britain and their concerns over immigration?
Well, Britain had more than its share of immigrants for a variety of pretty obvious reasons. First of all, the British labour market is very unregulated, deregulated. So it's easier to find part-time, often poorly paid jobs. Second, the British economy for a certain period was booming. Number three, English is a lingua franca. So if you are in Romania or you are in Latvia, the UK is the first obvious port of call if you're looking for a job. Germany in recent years has become an even bigger recipient, mostly of non-Europeans, because the Germans opened the doors when there was the big refugee crisis in 2015, and now Mrs. Merkel is paying the price domestically for opening the doors. Now, intra-European immigration, I think the British had a point, and I've been arguing all along that it was a mistake of the rest of the EU not to offer emergency clauses to British governments. Had they done so, probably Britain would have stayed. Always unhappy, but would have stayed. I think it's better to have an unhappy partner than to have a divorce. At least depends. It depends. I mean, it's very subjective. All right. So that was a mistake from the European side. But intra-EU immigration is not so explosive. The issue is extra-EU immigration. And that is a problem for which there is no simple answer. If you look around, the number of potential immigrants and refugees to Europe from its neighborhood is simply huge. What do you do? And how, first of all, do you distinguish between refugees that are asking for political asylum and economic immigrants? Is somebody who's coming from Somalia a refugee or an economic immigrant? Not obvious. Is somebody who's coming from Bangladesh or from Afghanistan or from Iraq a refugee or an economic immigrant? And what is the limit of countries that European societies can take? Rightly or wrongly, immigration has inflamed problems inside our countries, and now the anti-immigration parties are having a party. And this is very dangerous. So you have to find a way, because it's not good enough for me to have somebody who is a liberal and says we have to open our borders because people are in need. But if that leads to a number of semi-fascists coming to power in your country, then I think I have to find ways of controlling this. But this is going to be a very difficult decision for Europeans because the numbers are potentially huge. The Mediterranean is not an ocean. It's easily crossable. And if you take Greek islands, the Greek islands are about from 3 to 6 miles from the Turkish coast. How do you defend borders? I mean, people say, for example, you have to defend the external borders of the European Union. How exactly do you do that? Suppose you are faced with a dinghy boat full of immigrants, and they usually sink that boat in international waters. So what, you let people drown? You shoot at them? What exactly do you do? And if you take them, then you have to process the applications for asylum. The numbers are very large. And then you have the other parties in your countries that are having the party. Not easy, I'm afraid. My guess is that if the situation continues, and it's most likely to continue, we will have to experience rather unpleasant things in terms of our policies. And I'm not saying that with joy. Okay.
I have a question. As we know, the European Union is a confederation, and we have a model of confederation in our country here, Canada. And we disturb some of the wealth to the provinces where put it. Can that model work for Europe a little bit better?
Well, we are a different confederation from Canada. Yes, that Canada is a confederation and there is redistribution between provinces. So can the model apply to Europe? And my answer is that Europe is a rather different kind of confederation. It is not exactly obvious that a Finnish taxpayer feels an enormous amount of solidarity for a Cretan farmer. Okay? Because there has to be that kind of solidarity, or what the Germans call Gemeinschaft, sense of community, to accept the consequences of redistribution. So some redistribution takes place inside the European Union, but it is very limited. I mean, to give you an example, when Germany was reunified, when Eastern Germany became part of the Federal Republic, for years, for many years, for decades, something like 50% of the per capita income of an Eastern German was the result of subsidies from West Germany. 50%. Is there a way that you can persuade the German taxpayer to give 5% to Sicilian citizens? No way. Okay? So this is a very long process. There are elements. I mean, if you take Poland, which now has a government, peculiar, a government that has even the audacity sometimes to compare Brussels with Moscow, old Moscow. Right? Poland receives something of the order of 3 to 4% of its GDP in terms of net inflows of European funds every year. Not loans, free money, right, to build the roads. So, you know, so the Poles on the one hand have one of the highest levels of support because very often love comes through the pocket of citizens, and on the other hand elects a government that points the finger to Brussels every day. Interesting.
I think I'm next. To use your analogy of the to use your analogy of the golf club member, one of the proposals in the Tory government is essentially to create an offshore Singapore, if you will, off the coast of Europe, highly free trade, unregulated environment that could take advantage of its position to offer freer entry into the EU. If that were to proceed, how would the Europeans react?
Well, those who advocate a Singapore model are precisely the kind of people I have in mind when I say that some people live in cuckoo land. And I shall explain why. The Singapore free regulation, free trade model does not take into account the fact that the country is hugely divided with enormous inequalities, and many of the people who voted for Brexit are not yearning for free trade. They're yearning for protection, right? So you have to convince those people because they will vote against you immediately. Number one. Number two, why would Europe tolerate a Singapore island next to the European continent? Says, you know, and nowadays the most important thing that affects trade is not tariffs, because 3, 4, and 5% of tariffs doesn't mean very much. What is the crucial factor is different rules and regulations. So why should the rest of the EU accept essentially a rule-free rider on the side of the European continent that will be dumping goods into the European market? No way. No way.
We'll take one more question. You sure down there?
Yeah, quick question. My understanding was that under the previous, there's been sort of an agreement that's put in place regarding settlement. So if someone with who's British that settles in Paris or wherever in France or in Spain or whatever, they've got up to 2 years or something to that effect, and then they get permanent settlement. And it's the same in reverse if someone's European and they are in Britain. But that has maybe changed since there was an update, I think yesterday, in terms of the progress. So what is your take on that?
My take is that those people who can prove residence for a number of years already are likely to enjoy virtually the same rights as they had enjoyed pre-Brexit. There are, I can't remember the exact figure, but we're talking about a bit more, I think, than 3 million Europeans who live in the UK, and something like 1.5 to 2 million Brits who live in other European countries. But they're different, because the Europeans who are in the UK are very often young people. Those who come from Eastern Europe will be working in farmlands, and the others will be working in hotels and pubs, while most of the British who are in Europe are pensioners. Okay, so it's a different thing. Those people want to have access, free access to hospitals, which is guaranteed if you are a member of the EU, but is not guaranteed if you're not a member of the EU. So I think that the most likely thing is that those people who have been a few years, I think the British are going to use 5-year rule, who were there 5 years before Brexit, can enjoy those rights forever. So nothing changes. It's basically the new ones that will be changed. But again, with this transitional period, now the British have accepted that until the end of 2020, so 4.5 years after the referendum, they will still not have any control over the border. But they have no control over the border, but the number of people who are coming into the UK has declined dramatically because they're not interested. People, they don't see a future, so they don't come.
My second question, what if, currently Theresa May's government is being supported by the 10 members in Northern Ireland, and if they lost that membership, they lost that support, then the government would collapse in terms of being able to make any decisions. What if the government collapsed and someone came in and said, well, we're basically going to reverse this decision?
I don't think there is any real chance of reversing the decision, because interestingly enough, opinion polls show that the percentages have not changed. They're just about the same. Theresa May's government is a weak government, but is kept there because of the fear of the alternative, right? So the Conservative Party is torn, but it knows that if the government falls and if there is an early election, there's a strong possibility that Mr. Corbyn will become Prime Minister. So that's what keeps them hating each other but united. So it's another kind of unhappy marriage. So I don't think that there is a serious possibility of reversing the decision. One thing I cannot exclude is that a few years down the road, when we know and it's clear what Brexit means, there will be a British government that says, do we really want that? But we have to experience it for several years first. And I certainly do not belong to the category of people who want to make Brexit a disaster. No way. One should find a modus vivendi, respecting the sensitivities of the British. The British are an important member of the European family. If they decide to live apart, okay, but let us find another relationship that doesn't call its name.
What about the notion of Scotland?
Okay, I think we've exhausted our speaker with enough questions, and on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank you for a very illuminating presentation. Thank you very much.